It doesn't matter that The Great Mrs. McGrady in season 24 of Arthur is a remake, it's still just as emotional as watching it the first time round. I'm not going to go into as much detail about the episode now because I went into quite extensive and very emotional detail when I discussed the episode when it appeared in, I think, season 13. But I just want to kind of mention briefly 2 points. The first point is that it's still just as emotional. None of the emotional quality or the raw difficulty of watching it has disappeared, and I think the reason or the fact that they decided to remake this episode, and I'll talk about why they remade it in a moment, proves that it's probably the most powerful, important, impactful episode of Arthur. Had it been, any other episode, they might have just, pulled it from release, and that's it. We never would have seen the story again. But this is such an important story and such a moving and powerful episode that it made perfect sense that they would redo it. Now, there are only 3 episodes in the 24th season, and since one of them is a repeat, it's technically only 2 fresh episodes. Not really a fan of that, but this episode is so powerful. So the reason that it was remade, and I should point out that when I watched it the first time, I didn't know that it was later remade. It wouldn't have affected my enjoyment of it, but it's just worth pointing out that I didn't know it was remade. It didn't affect my enjoyment of it, because in the previous episode, Lance Armstrong features quite heavily, and he provides a great inspirational source for Francine by telling his cancer story, and motivating Francine to do what she can to help Mrs. McGrady. Because if you're unaware, Mrs. McGrady has cancer, and it's such an incredibly moving episode. And obviously, because of, well, very obvious reasons, they pulled that episode, which I kind of agree with and I kind of don't, because the episode itself wasn't necessarily celebrating Lance Armstrong's sporting achievements, whether it was done through doping or otherwise. I don't think it was that big of a deal because his cancer story is still realistic and still the motivating factor, not his sporting achievements. But because they made the decision to pull it but remake it, I think it's okay. What I think doesn't work as well about this episode is because they've replaced Lance Armstrong with Uncle Slam, who is Binky's favourite wrestler. And on the one hand, showing Uncle Slam as this strong, powerful, successful wrestler who's had cancer, overcome it, and gone on to live this, successful life with his great sporting career, that's a really positive message. But at the same time, his story doesn't hit as hard because he's not a real person. And I don't know if they made any effort to find a guest voice who had cancer and who would be willing to tell their story in Arthur, or if they just decided, doesn't matter, let's just go with Uncle Slam instead. If they'd made the effort and couldn't find anybody, that's understandable. If they decided to just go with Uncle Slam, it feels like a bit of a cop-out, because one of the other reasons the original Mrs. McGrady story is emotional is because you have that additional layer of a real human having gone through something similar and come out the other side, and watching it, knowing that a real human has done that, makes it more moving and more hopeful. But when you say, oh, this fictitious character has had cancer and survived, you're like, well, yeah, but it's a fictitious character. Where's the motivational story? Obviously, it's not that it doesn't. It's not that it's not moving, but it's not as effective as if they'd had a real person with a real story and could provide real hope. But it is effective, just not as effective. So if they tried to find somebody and couldn't, I'd say that's completely understandable. But if they didn't and they just decided to go with Uncle Slam, maybe for budgeting reasons, I'm getting the sense that this stage in Arthur they weren't exactly raking it in anymore, hence the reason why the show's not got that many episodes left, then it feels like a bit of a cop-out. But either way, the episode's still powerful, it's still moving. Would I recommend watching this or the other one? Honestly, I'd recommend watching them both, just from a creative perspective. I'm sure the show would say don't watch the other one, but from a creative perspective, I definitely say give both a watch, because it's really interesting to see what changes had to be made without any real difference to the narrative structure. So it's impressive in that regard. the ultimate message, or messages are really moving as well. But I'm not too sure how I feel about the decision to use Uncle Slam. I would definitely need more context on whether they tried to find anybody. But either way, The Great Mrs. McGrady is still a fabulous, moving, emotional, raw, important episode, and easily one of the best.